Welcome everybody, my name is Deborah Fisher, I'm the Executive Director of A Blade of Grass. Thanks for coming out tonight, this is going to be a really fun program. I want to start by thanking our host this evening, Donald and Shelley Rubin, and also the 8th floor staff. Thanks guys for being such gracious hosts. I also want to thank the fantastic panelists that we will be listening to this evening. The 8th floor is a private exhibition and event space created by Shelley and Vaughn to promote cultural and philanthropic initiatives. The next show coming up is called Drapetomania. It is curated by Alejandro de la Fuente, and it explores the impact of an Afro-Cuban art movement called Grupo Antillano. This should be very interesting. Blade of Grass is a funding nonprofit that is solely dedicated to nurturing socially engaged art. And we do that in a couple of different ways. We fund individuals and institutions that are working in leadership roles, actively in communities, at ambitious scale to enact social change. And we also create rich programming and web content like tonight's program that contextualizes this work and makes it more visible. We are really excited about, let me get my notes, let me make sure that I'm not forgetting anything. I have some announcements. We have a lot going on at A Blade of Grass this spring. The first thing is we're looking very forward to announcing this year's first class of A Blade of Grass socially engaged art fellows. This is going to happen sometime in late March, and we are, and fellows receive $20,000 stipend, documentation and assessment and consulting services that are geared toward increasing the effectiveness of their art in everyday life. Our next program, like this, is a month from today, exactly 1 month from today, so mark your calendars. It's called Parallel Fields. It's a regular series that we do that pairs an artist and a non-artist who are doing very similar things so that they can talk about how their work is the same and different. The program on March 19th is featuring our first Distinguished Artist Fellow, Mel Chin, and it's about policy change. It's going to be very interesting. Also mark your calendars for Open Engagement. It is a 2-day free conference about social practice at the Queen's Museum this year. It's May 16th through the 18th. Open Engagement is a project of artist Jim de los Reyes, and it is co-presented this year by Queen's Museum and The Blade of Grass. We also want to remind you that we have fantastic web content. Go check us out check out our website, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter, right? I'd like to introduce our fantastic panelists this evening. Tonight's panelist is called Aesthetics of Doing. Hi, Roxanne, have a seat. Tonight's panel is called Aesthetics of Doing. It's a regular program that we do that tackles some of the thornier issues around social practice. Tonight we're going to be talking about effectiveness. How do you define effectiveness in an art context? What does success look like? How much is enough? Can there be effectiveness in failure? Great questions. And we have great people to answer these questions. We want to start with Art Jones. Is a New York-based artist who works in film, digital video, audio, and hybrid media. He has produced pieces for MTV and the New York City Department of Health, and he's collaborated with musicians and artists including Sound Lab, DJ Spooky, Philip Virus with Alec Empire, Telescene, Miri Baraka, Bends with Fatal Breaks, and Anti-Pop Consortium. Todd Lester is an artist and founder and a Blade of Grass grantee of freeDimensional. freeDimensional is a grantee of A Blade of Grass, an organization that supports free expression worldwide, often by placing artists who are at political risk into artist residency programs. Todd's current project is called Lanchonete.org. It's an artist residency and lunch counter based in Sao Paulo that he's been working on since 2005. Risa Wilson, unfortunately, is ill and cannot join us this evening, but pinch hitting for Risa is Elizabeth Grady, our own programs director at A Blade of Grass. Elizabeth came to us from the Smart Power program, which is an initiative of the State Department, and it was the U.S. State Department, and it was run by the Bronx Museum. right? This program put 15 artists into social practice projects in 15 countries worldwide in order to do cultural diplomacy, right? Elizabeth is also the curator of Proyecto Paladar, a project in Cuba that was a part of the 11th Cuban Biennial. And she's held curatorial positions at the Whitney, SF MoMA, and MoMA. Our moderator this evening is artist Paul Ramirez Jonas. He's a multidisciplinary artist who works, lives, and teaches in New York City. His work often focuses on the relationship between artist, artwork, and audience, and has been exhibited in museums and biennials worldwide. In 2010, his Key to the City project was presented by Creative Time in cooperation with the City of New York. Paul, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. I guess this will follow a fairly standard panel discussion format, where each of the panelists will discuss and consume all the time, and then there will be no time for questions or discussion. No, just kidding. Each person will present really briefly some contextual information, right? And then we will begin with some semi-prepared questions. And eventually you can all jump in and ask questions towards the end, but if you're really moved to ask something, just interrupt us. Right? That seems fair. So we have these mics that are directional, I remember that. So should we just start this way with Todd?
Yes.
Maybe artist.
Yeah, you can keep that.
Oh, I can keep the mic.
Yeah, keep that mic. Do you want artists to go first on their slides or me?
His slides are first.
His are?
Okay. I stand corrected. We're starting
Okay, am I on? Great.
Okay.
Okay. I'll try to be as brief and go through these as quickly as possible. Most of the hybrid media and installation, sound and video-based work comes out of my background as a filmmaker. Trained in more or less traditional filmmaking, used to say kind of individual practice, working collaboratively but with usual hierarchy and division of labor where there's the director. And sort of my attempts to subvert that paradigm a little bit and work more collaboratively on an even level in a relationship with artists and also with members of whatever particular community. This is a mock-up for the Selector project, which is based on the Jamaican sound systems that began popular in the 1960s. In the context of the Caribbean, of course, besides being something that brings the party to the people, this was also a means of bringing social commentary, satire, news, and politics to people that lived in rural areas. So I designed this variable cart. This mock-up has collapsible speakers in order to bring it to context here in the overdeveloped world. Here's a proof of concept of the project at Ivy Center in 2009. I was projecting on the outside of the space. This version is based on corrugated plastic, old car batteries, other car parts. The most expensive thing is the laptop, the webcam, and the projector, which could be snatched and thrown into a backpack if I had to run away from criminals, police, or other ne'er-do-wells. This is the design that was collaboratively developed by workshop artists in Karachi, Pakistan in the summer of 2012. I was there to do the international version of the Selector project and do a live audio-video performance. I was facilitating this. The performance was actually performed by the workshop artists in a public shopping center in Karachi. The project is variable. It has to be sourced, of course, with local materials. And in this case, it was important that the design be in line with an aesthetic that people were familiar with, such as the local truck art, where the buses and trucks are painted very elaborately. And this is the piece. This is where it was performed in Port Brand, which is a major shopping center. This was a sort of side project I did during my trip in Karachi. There's a mobile school bus that picks up children whose parents both work, and they're basically left on their own. The age range is from about 6 years old to about 14, and they teach several classes a day. I was asked to be the guest artist, and we did a self-portrait project. The kids learned how to use cameras and quickly frame and compose an image, and they photographed each other. This is a mock-up for a recent residency at the Laundromat project. I was situated at a laundromat in Hunts Point and interviewed local residents about what they felt was a need in terms of resources for shopping, everyday buying and selling in a particular 3-block area. Portraits are installed in the portholes of the laundromats, and there are listening stations where you can hear oral histories and commentary of local residents. This is a current project, Instant Karma Portraits, which I use an old Polaroid camera to document people in their environments, what I'm calling their natural environments, which is usually work, play, or home. The Bronx. I did a proposal for the Washington, D.C. 5x5 project, which places 25 artists in different sites over the summer. What I proposed was a project in the Anacostia neighborhood, which is really known as the Hood in D.C., if anyone's familiar with that area. In which residents would do urban design from the ground up. Instead of the usual hierarchy in which experts come in and it's usually part of a larger development plan, I was curious about what would happen if I were to approach residents and say, what do you want in your neighborhood, as outlandish as that might be. So someone might say, well, I'd really like a rainbow bridge going from my home to the laundromat. And then we would build it in using 3D printing techniques and situate the idealized neighborhood, make little models that would then be situated outside the existing locations. So that's it.
Hi everybody, my name is Todd. I'm going to try to get the slides going, and I think they will go on their own. I told you all that I can get distracted easily with technology, so please don't make me push a button and talk at the same time. She let me do that. So what you're seeing behind you are pictures from a walk that I took in Sao Paulo with a local photographer, Pedro Marquez, to just photograph the lanchonettes that basically those that move me. I've been thinking about doing a project called Lanchonete for the last 9 years, and so just last year I thought, let me try to get some of the imagery to people who I've been talking to it about outside of Sao Paulo so that they might understand what it is that's motivating me. So as those kind of slide by, I'm going to give maybe a slightly broader framework. As Deborah said, I started something about 10 years ago that's called freeDimensional, and I put some brochures up on the front. I also have a copy of our Spanish language toolkit. It's called Culture Workers, Safety and Readiness. So at year 8 or 9 in freeDimensional's existence, and as Deborah said, it is an organization that works with residencies all over the world to host culture workers and activists in distress. And now in its 8th or 9th year, we're right at the cusp, we've started doing a new thing, which is to take some of the learning that we've gained in working with around 200 culture workers in distress this last decade and taking it back to some of the very regions and locations where some of those people in distress have come from to us for our services. And so we had the inaugural Culture Worker Readiness Workshop in Mexico City about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago. We're gearing up for Culture Worker Readiness and Safety workshops in both East Africa and Southeast Asia. And very quickly, I'll point over into the third row where Marianne DeLeague is sitting on this side. She is one of our colleagues, and so she can maybe help answer some questions afterwards. And I think there are brochures up front. I wanted to rush through that really quickly because, of course, you know, as a founder of an organization, you know, there's always that question, do you get away from it? And I have been trying steadfastly for the last few years to actually get away from freeDimensional. Not so far away, I am on its board, but to move away from the day-to-day and also sort of at a meta level, really test to see if it's possible as a founder to not give so much lifeblood and sweat equity into something that you've started. And of course, I work with some great colleagues, and thank you again to Blade of Grass for supporting freeDimensional. Residency is a theme that connects both freeDimensional to Lanchonete, the project that I am giving more of my love to these days and what I'll talk to you tonight about. But one thing I'd like to say is that a very conscious difference in the two projects is I started freeDimensional as an administrator, an arts administrator. It is my academic background, public administration and film. And 10 years on, I am very consciously starting Lanchonete as an art project. I see it as a Boycean social sculpture. I've been very much influenced by Boyce, but not only. I'm very influenced by Lefebvre and his writings on the rights to the city, by Desserteau, Walking in the City, by Walter Benjamin and his idea of the flaneur, and more locally, specifically in Sao Paulo itself, there's such an art history of projects that engage the city, such as Articidade. And so I wanted to make that distinction because I think once we start talking about effectiveness, that you can turn the dial on it depending on where you're coming from. Real quickly before I stop, I'll just give you a brief description of what Lanchonete is, and then I'll hand it back over to the moderation to Elizabeth. Lanchonete.org celebrates Sao Paulo's ubiquitous lunch counters and their role in the life of the center. Through a 5-year process, the project invites international artists and Brazilian artists from other states to reside in and thus develop a relationship with the center of Sao Paulo, its citizens, institutions, issues, and patterns. Begun as a research project, Lanchonete.org materializes into a community-owned restaurant managed by the membership of a cultural association that has been created. So right now, we're in the second year of the 5-year project, and the restaurant should open late this year or early next year. But what is so fascinating to me, because I'm much more, I geek out much more on the invisible side of the project, which is the cultural association, so that there is already an infrastructure that is a membership body for owning the eventual business as Trojan horse, as I call it. But I think a lot of folks asking about the project want to see that material side of it, which is sort of time delayed. Like it's not intended to be here yet, and it is emerging at a slower pace, one that is discerned by several more people besides myself who's speaking to you tonight. So there's some of these brochures on the table up front. And then lastly, I just came from a meeting at the Restaurant Opportunity Center. I put some of their little brochures on the front table here as well. What I'm doing as I sort of dive into this project is I'm really, even at a distance, I won't move to Sao Paulo until later this year to stay for the 3 years of the material phase. But I'm trying even here in New York to really dive in to better understand that angle of the project, which is the food justice and food service angle. And I've been helped along that research process with the Restaurant Opportunity Center, so I want to give them a plug.
Elizabeth will not provide contextual information.
I'm a curator, I'm not an artist.
All right. I didn't bring images, but I'll just say, for the context of this panel, that unlike art, I sort of cut on really slowly. So it's taken me 25 years to go very reluctantly, I would say, even from a traditional studio artist to a more socially engaged artist. But in that very slow trajectory, I've had to present, let's use that word, in venues ranging from the state, private galleries, museums, even some brushes with the federal government. And it reminds me of something that Shannon Jackson said that I heard, that artists are increasingly becoming hybrid in their practice, but the venues are not becoming hybrid. So what is interesting is that socially engaged art, because it is trying to be part of the social fabric of the world, is a hybrid practice, but the sources of funding and the presenters are not necessarily so. So in each aspect of my career, or I've had to always be measured for effectiveness, and I felt being measured. So I guess that would be the first question. It's like, we all know how to measure traditional arts, and we all know how to measure something. For example, in a museum, you will measure the effectiveness of art by how many visitors have come to the exhibition. Perhaps in a gallery, you might measure the effectiveness of a show by the length of words in a review, or where those reviews were published, right? Because not all reviews are the same. Maybe the amount of money the gallery made. So we all know how we are measured as artists. But my first question, anyone can take it first, is how are we going to be measured, since that's really what's at the crux of effectiveness by an outside source? Do we want to just submit to whatever venue is presenting us, and it's like, I'll morph to your measurement? Or do we want to translate that? Do we want to get ahead of it and say, no, we propose to be measured in this way? And I'm so happy to be asking the questions.
Who is going to take that question?
Who is going to take that one?
They're always like, they're always different, I mean, not so much different agendas, but different stakeholders, right? I mean, I can speak about the Smart Power program that brought me to Karachi, and the major stakeholders would be the State Department, the U.S. State Department that was actually funding this adventure, and the Bronx Museum of the Arts that was coordinating it at a very kind of ground level. And then, of course, the artist, and then the host organization in the country where you're going. As the artist component of this process, I certainly had to be aware of possible measures of success in terms of all the stakeholders. And I think there's no way that I couldn't account in terms of the design of the project, couldn't account for that. I mean, I'd love to be able to say that ideally it's just about what I as the artist am thinking about, but that's never going to work, I think, in any kind of social practice context anyway, because the nature of the work pushes you away from that artist in the studio or even outside the studio doing your individual project. You know, it was very clear that Smart Power was not a fellowship for us to do our work, but rather to engage, right, with people at different levels in the local community. So already you have to start to take that into account. Of course, on the other hand, it's impossible to try to second guess and figure out exactly what all the stakeholders want, what their particular metric will be. But in my case, coming from the background of doing these media performances that are definitely ephemeral, time-based in nature, I realized that there was a thing that I had to do, and there was a piece that I wanted that would be made, right, that we could then document, and that an aspect of that documentation might be the measure of success for that particular project.
I have some notes, but I mean, the question, say it again in short form if you don't mind.
How do you know it was okay? No.
I was writing in response to it, but then I forgot what the question
actually, art has expanded. It's like, it's really what happens when you're in a situation where there's multiple people who have multiple stakes in what you're doing. So each one is going to measure it differently, right? Like, you articulate really well, right? It's like the State Department wants something, the people coming to the selector want something different, maybe the law wants something, you want something. How do we want, as artists, do we want to go with the flow, is my question, or do we want to construct our own idea of how these products should be measured?
I mean, I think, there's one kind of tool that we can use to do a scan of stakeholders. I mean, certainly we can know who those different stakeholders are, who has more power, and how many stakeholders there are, and where they're located. These are all things that are easy to know via tools, management tools. But, and I said this on the phone call that we had to prep for the talk, that, I think that there's the discrete things that we do, and then I think there's a meta space where something else is playing out. And, I think that in that meta space, what's playing out is kind of a fight between the rational and the irrational, or the scientific method versus an artistic method. And then I think instrumentalization fits in there as well. What I am very interested in are artist-derived methods. And what I think happens sometimes whenever you're figuring out whose effectiveness you lean towards is that there's the notion that when art can be socially beneficial, it's often beneficial in the spaces where there haven't been other solutions. And so sometimes, let me just see what I wrote here, I say to overlay a measurement approach on a potential thing is to presuppose that we know what is needed or wanted, and ultimately what will help if that also is desired. And so, I tend to think that it's very hard when starting a process to know what the outcome will be and therefore what would be measured until you ask all the different stakeholders. And
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that question, I mean, speaking from the funder's perspective, and Risa, who would have been here, was a funder with the Rauschenberg Foundation. Depending on the funder's perspective, it can be a very transactional thing. And that's a term that Risa actually used in that phone call, and luckily I was listening in so I can share that idea with you. The State Department, for example, to take Art's point, was very transactional. They're inputting something, they want to give an output, right? It's very quantitative, it's very specific. They're spending a certain amount of money, and they want a certain result, right? It's almost like kind of a business approach. The trick is to balance the qualitative with the quantitative, right? How do you tell the story? How do you make, you're talking about the invisible parts of what you're doing, right? How do you make the invisible visible? And at A Blade of Grass, what we're doing is crafting a program that we hope will be able to do just that. And assessment is crucial, not in the sense of evaluating an artist, right? Are you getting what you paid for? Rather in the sense of understanding the process and making that process visible, trying to, from a sort of a curatorial perspective, be able to translate that for an outside audience so that they understand really the meat of what's happening, right? Understand the value of what the artist is doing and the quality in a very positive way of their engagement with the community with whom they work.
And actually that segues perfectly. Maybe to make it concrete, because it's interesting to speak abstractly, but I thought if each one of you has an example of something that was good, but it was invisible and you suspect maybe even immeasurable because it was invisible. And maybe you don't even want to make visible. But it was something in a project that you were like, that thing I cannot show, I will not show, cannot be measured, cannot be argued for. But I know that is effective. Even the language is difficult. Anyone has anything like that? I can get one. Just well, this was a strange moment in effectiveness, because I don't know if it was effective, but when we were making Key to the City, Gavin Krober and I went to a meeting with Port Authority to try to convince them to let us use the site. And it was a boardroom with people from Port Authority, like manage our bridges and everything. What was really interesting was right there was a conversation that was not part of the artwork. It was just something in part of constructing of the process of making the artwork. But it was just interesting to see people who are holding things in the public trust responding to an artwork and arguing among themselves that this is public property and it should be open to the public, but they need to protect it from terrorism, from vandalism, but they realize that it's public and they want to participate. So it was just an interesting moment where like, oh wow, bureaucrats really do take their job super seriously at Port Authority, and they really see this as the commons, and they understand the problem, and they're going to try to figure it out on their own. That cannot be measured, folded into documentation, and yet it's just something that actually did happen because of an art project. So I was just digging out for examples of something, just to see if we can get to something concrete that escapes measurement. And
I mean, I think that in projects that I've curated, the what's invisible and immeasurable is usually about relationships that are built and what people are learning from one another. And what it looks like in documentation is a bunch of people sitting around doing something you don't understand, to quote one of my favorite people. And what's happening is this deep connection. For example, the project that I did in Cuba, what we had were, on the one side of a dining table, we had Americans sitting there. On the other side of the dining table, there were Cubans sitting there, and they were sharing a meal and communicating. This is something that's essentially illegal on both sides, right? The Cubans aren't really allowed, unless they have special licenses to talk to tourists, they're not really allowed to talk in a real way with tourists. And Americans aren't usually allowed to engage with Cubans unless they have a special license from our government. And so, it was something that was very subversive, and all people were doing was saying, what's your day like? What is it like when you get up in the morning? Is this something you usually eat, or is this something that's special for you? And that's the kind of ordinary conversation that humanized the relationship, right, between the Americans and the Cubans. It didn't become about governments or nationality or identity or any of that. It was like, hey, what kind of a person are you? What do you like? What do you not like, right? That's just one example. Or in Smart Power, there was an artist, Papona Sorio, who did a project in Nepal. And the project itself was beautiful, but what was important was the way that he worked with the other artists, the way that he worked with the participants. And none of that really comes through in documentation in a deep way. But teaching them his process of engaging with community, they were mostly students, right, university students, so teaching was an appropriate mode. That was the meaningful part. And they can go out and kind of spread that engagement style in a place where that's just really not typical. It's very studio art based for the most part, the education.
Well, I think about an organization like the Laundromat Project, which sort of, places artists in these laundromats. So by design, these are spaces that are based on activity rather than kind of finished products, unless getting your washing done is the product, right? But an organization like that, which puts a lot of time and resources in training their residents and their fellows to engage with community at a really deep level. For me, it's almost like there's an awareness that part of the measure of success is that process of acclimating the artist to engage in the community. To the point that, I did my project in Hunts Point, but at some point I began to realize that the project was going to outlive the residency period. As soon as the snow melts, I'll be back there and taking photographs and hopefully putting them in those portals in the laundromat. I think for me a measure of success is the way in which, as an artist, that habit of mind gets formed. That of course I'm going to engage with community, and of course it's going to be a sustained kind of engagement, that can be measured, not necessarily over the course of months, or project to project, but rather, like you're saying, Elizabeth, what's the depth of that engagement?
Excuse me. Thank you for bringing us down into the concrete, because I think it's easier to talk with a specific reference. And I'd like to say a little bit more about the Lanchonete project before I give the example of this invisible success. And just to tell you why I'm doing it, you know, I started visiting Sao Paulo in 2005 for other reasons, for other sort of conferences and business trips and things, and I quite simply fell in love with the center of the city. I really enjoy the center of Sao Paulo. I could be a tour promoter for it. That's how much I love it. I love the architecture, the people, the sometimes chaoticness, the art, the theater, which is huge. So what I'm also saying, because it was certainly 5 or 6 years after I met this part of the city, before I had the idea of doing a project. So it was a very organic thing that came about through discussions with people who I'm now doing the project with, and sort of a consensus that we will do something. But the reason why we chose the Lanchonete is that, I mean, this is something similar to our bodega in New York that is ubiquitous. There are thousands of Lanchonete in Sao Paulo alone. And in the older sort of architectural construction, they are very often porous structures, so that the whole front is open versus opening a door. Or if it's on a corner, both fronts are open and you could literally pass through it. And what I think is so important about it as kind of a signifier for the project, but one that it materializes into, is that it is an example of a cross-class consumption point. And what I think about Sao Paulo, I definitely think living in New York for over a decade is training for living in Sao Paulo. Like, I feel like, a city twice as big as this city, you need some training before you step up to that level city as a citizen. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't hide its fortification as a city. I think, we certainly live in a quite fortified city, but one that's very good at hiding it. So, we don't see the fortifications. It's behind the scenes in some ways. And what I think about Sao Paulo is that it is in some senses a caricature of fortification. Of course, there are 5 class levels in Brazil, and as you ascend or descend those class levels, if you have enough money, you could easily have a bulletproof car. If you have enough money to travel with a helicopter, most tall buildings have landing pads. It's very likely that your apartment building is guarded with an armed guard. There are these things that don't hide themselves from you as an observer. And so to find something that is culturally subscribed to as a cross-class consumption point that is not secure at all in the way you enter it is pretty important, I think, in a city that is always stratifying more and more. That gentrification, if we wanted to call it that, is happening at an aggressive, if not violent level in a neighborhood like the center. So all that taken or mentioned, I would argue for the utility of an outsider. So that certainly there are hundreds, if not thousands, of artists, cultural producers, community organizers who are doing the labor of claiming the right to the city. But what I think that you get sometimes in these circumstances with an outsider such as myself, and also some of the international artists who help to come there, is you get different perspectives on the same problems and the same issues. And so the invisible success, getting to the point, is that as an outsider, I do think sometimes it's easier to see class differences. And when you're doing something collaboratively, and this is where I'll talk about the brochure. This is a brochure of 3 days of activities we did during the Architecture Biennale last year. What I think the success was is that we brokered across class to achieve something that involved 50 or 60 different players, so organizations, peoples, etc. And I mention that because in the context of, say, an urban gardening initiative in the periphery of Sao Paulo, that we did an event in the garden. And one of the organizers, one of our partners to it, you would say it's a sort of bourgeois outfit. I mean, you might say that I'm a bourgeois outfit. I'm not trying to impugn in when I say that, but you could kind of like clock the class of the person and the organization. And at one point, the garden said, you will have to pay the gardeners to be there that day. And the Brazilian woman who I'm talking about, her reaction was, why can't they see that this is going to benefit them? And for me, and I'm not saying this because I was a smarty pants, but really that outsider position gave me insight to it. I saw, it might be true that there'll be a middle or long-term benefit from what we're doing by bringing awareness to the garden, but what's for sure is the short-term benefit is what's important here for those gardeners, whether or not they would give their Sunday to work in the garden that they work in every day. And so I found that the invisible success was being able to really, work across those classes and have there be a positive outcome at all those class levels.
It's funny because you brought up the Trojan horse, and it made me, and you're both describing, all three of you are describing like effects that an artwork or an art activity can have in the back end, sort of like the invisible part. And one thing that I'm worried, I don't know if I'm worried, but it's like, do we have to be in a position where there's the Trojan horse, where you say like, this is the art project, and it can be measured in all the ways that make you comfortable, but it's just a Trojan horse. Really, the effectiveness is all around it in what you described, in like what is happening when it's being made, on the people sitting across the table, on something that exceeds the longevity that it's supposed to have. And again, it's like, is it easier to just say, well, we're just going to create this facet that you can see, that is the facet that satisfies the foundation or the institution, while I know that there's this other effect, and I'm not going to worry about articulating it or formalizing it, or do we want to keep it secret, or do we want to bring that into the fold and say these things are really important, and these things actually should be talked about. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I'd like to just jump back in if I may. That you mentioned earlier that while the forms and things are changing in the art world, that perhaps the funding structures aren't. I would say yes and no. I agree with that. I think that one of the ways that we might do projects like this is by seeing other funding structures besides those in the art world. So, for example, you know, as I go out, particularly in Brazil, and try to raise money for the business component, which is only one component of it, you know, I'm talking a social business or social entrepreneurship talk. And I've even been told by some of my colleagues who, you know, were helping me set up the meetings, don't mention the art. Like, do not talk about, don't enter the art, but enter as a social business, and then maybe, if you catch their interest, come to the art. And so, you know, whereas I hate that those gymnastics might be necessary. You know, it's also true that with funders, you rarely get more than, you know, just a small amount of time. So it's also kind of picking which entry point to come into the project. Because we're certainly looking at non-arts funders for the project, even though I will hold it as an art project, as its referee.
Well, and I think, I mean, you know, since it's an example I brought up, I mean, for the Cuba project, we were actually completely upfront about, the artist was Craig Shillito, and I created it. And it was actually, you know, putting it in an art context is what made it happen. And the communication was foregrounded as positive. And people who supported the project, particularly those coming from the States, and almost all the support came from this side for obvious reasons, were buying into that, right? And so it wasn't so much something sneaky, it was really a selling point. And I think that, as you know, speaking from a funder perspective, it's valuing that part. I mean, that's the art part, right? And so it's about making that art part something that people can understand. You know, when you hear a description of, you know, like the Lanchonete project, right? It sounds like something. Well, it's just a lunch counter, right? It's like, well, no, it's an art project, and it's translating like what makes it art. I think that's actually one of the things that makes it fundable. People can get excited about it. It's trying to find that way into a situation, an idea, a community that hasn't been found before. Where traditional ways of dealing with the problem, the issue, the question have been ineffective, right? And so it's the art part that makes it work, in my opinion.
Actually, one of the questions we discussed was like that we're in a transition moment. One of the questions because we have a meeting before, was that can something succeed as an artwork and fail as a force of social change, or vice versa? Can something do the reverse? And I think that betrays an anxiety that, you know, like, will the art world be like, well, that was great, but that was not a good artwork, and reverse, like a social justice funder or public would say, well, maybe that's great art, but from where I stand, that was not effective social change. And it's like, you know, maybe it's better, we should maybe find a way to be upfront and say, these things cannot be separated. But again, I just brought this up because it really struck me for tonight. I was speaking with someone who's close to me about this panel, and they said, well, what about this? I'm filling out this grant from like an institution that remain nameless, like very venerable foundation, and the question is, for the grant. What evidence do you have that the context of the content of the work produced or presented will matter to those who will experience it? Please answer in 400 words or less. So she's basically saying, I'm happy to fund you if you can tell me ahead of time, right, that this is going to work. And I was like, oh, there's that conflict of, what do you say, rationality versus irrationality. It's like, please rationalize the irrational ahead of time, even. Right? But I guess I get back to, can anyone take a stab at what would be then the ways of measuring effectiveness that artists who are socially engaged would find appropriate? Or that would not kill the irrational? No idea.
I think
But you're sitting in that side.
part of the process, right? Part of the process that sees organizations that are specifically devoted to social practice, right? It's part of this process of figuring out exactly how that effectiveness will get measured, but also kind of fill a key role as kind of interlocutors, like the middleman between maybe higher level funders, right? These kinds of organizations are critical to the conversation, right? Yeah, it's the art world, right? We're used to a certain duality. So I'm certainly like doing this kind of weird stuff, or trying to do this kind of weird stuff for years. I'm used to kind of the stealth mode. Like, yeah, give me the money, and then I'm really gonna do this, Look over here, So I'm really used to that mode. But then, in recent years, working with organizations that actually really get it, right? They say, okay, we understand the difficulty of translation, and they kind of work with you and try to figure out how the project can happen with all of its ephemerality and all of the invisible aspects of it more or less intact. And they do that, I think, by trying to shift the conversation towards talking about a process of engagement with audiences and what happens, and that has inherent value.
Right. And I think you spoke really well when you said how you're trained as a filmmaker, but what you're trying to do is kind of mess with that hierarchy of filmmaking. So it's like, when you said that, I was like, well, it almost doesn't matter what film is produced as long as that hierarchy of filmmaking is
critical part of the process.
Yeah, or the selector. It's like, it makes me think of in the Caribbean Carnival, how would you measure the effectiveness of Carnival, right? A third of the people dance, a third of the people make the costume, a third of the people cook the food for the other third. Once you have 100% participation in an island, that kind of conversation about effectiveness becomes meaningless. No.
I'll speak to it a little bit. The original question, I thought again of this idea of guaranteeing deliverables, where if it would be a success socially and not artistically, or vice versa. And I guess I think that we've convinced ourselves that we can frame social change in that way, or even art in that way. Where I think that I think about the doggedness of so many of the artists that I know and work with, and how if you gave them the challenge of how to make their work both artistically successful, or something they would be proud of, and something that, let's say, the site or the community in which they're doing it would be proud of it. So like this, maybe pride is the litmus there. That I think that if you gave them the space to do the project, they would find a way to achieve both of those things. I think that a limiting factor would be to presuppose what the deliverables to guarantee would be, and where you're going to be checked off, like, okay, you succeeded because you did this. I think to have to presuppose those is how you get the failure. Because I think also, I think about myself as a white man going to anywhere, but as a gringo, let's say in Sao Paulo, the power and who has power or is perceived to have power is something that, you can be introspective about it and be aware of the agency differences. But then also, you also have this, I feel like there's an intuitiveness to trust building and consensus building that is not about like asking, say, people, do you want to work in this project? But it's much more something that is so visceral and hard to write down. And so, I can move forward certain elements of the Lanchonete project because I deeply believe that I have trust and vice versa with someone or some group. But to even write that down, I would be almost auto-suspect. I'd be like, what does that mean if I write down that they trust me, versus the lived experience. So it's not really an answer, but I'm just trying to say that for me, going forward is an intuitive thing, and I always get into the dilemma when I try to write that down.
Yeah, in preparing for this panel, the last thing we discussed was something that came to mind, that that social practice, maybe by its nature, is ephemeral and time-based, event-based, and that what we gave up with permanent art and objects, like that the ease with permanent art and objects and images, that you can defer the effectiveness. You can say, this can come out of storage and be shown in 100 years, and maybe then it's really going to click. But that there's a certain pressure on socially engaged art projects because of the ephemerality to, in the present, argue for their effectiveness. There isn't that avant-gardist thing that you can fall back on and say, the people of the future, when they look at this, or even that it's effective forever, right? It can be dusted off and it'll be effective again. I don't know where that leaves us, but it just made me wonder if social change is tied to ephemerality in some way that we don't quite understand.
Well, I would ask, again, it's a generalized equation, let's say, but is community organizing tied to ephemerality? Because, I'm not someone, I don't, refer to my project as a socially engaged project, whereas it in fact is engaging with asocial. And I think that projects that are framed that way, I would say almost by definition, have a facet of community organizing in them. And therefore, you could look at a bigger kind of envelope of just how life transpires, how communities organize around issues, and I think they're always somewhat ephemeral. So I don't know, I'm dancing around your question, but
I don't even know what the question is.
I think another way of thinking of ephemerality is sustainability, where sure it's ephemeral, but it's evolving, right? And so that's a question that comes up with these kinds of projects a lot, right? Is great, you've started something, how do you keep it going? How do you keep it alive in the community? How do you keep it meaningful for the people who have participated and continue to participate? And so ephemerality becomes actually an evolving question of sustainability, where the project continues to shift and change in meaning and inflection over time.
Right. That seems like a really interesting way to deal with it, is to say it's not to seek to become an object or an image again, but it's to seek to become sustainable, renewable.
It's a process. It's a process, not a product.
But also, I personally, continuity is a more attractive word to me or frame than sustainability, because I worry sometimes that sustainability disincentivizes failure when, not that you strive for failure, but certainly, it does happen in the course of success often. Because for me, I have always, if a deliverable of Lanchonete is a material restaurant, I will be the last one to tell you that it's guaranteed. So it's I know the chances of it happening and not happening.
What is guaranteed is that our public must have some questions for us.
Thank you. Just got a question. Nobody has a question? Seriously? Okay, Roxanne. Excellent.
I don't really have a question, but I just wondered, as you were all talking about the visible and invisible, it sort of felt like those of us who might not, I've done very little art in my life, but I know that being on the creative side of the art, and I'm totally somewhat intoxicated with what I'm doing and not thinking too much about anyone else, but when I'm on the other side, I often wonder about accessibility, so that when you see as invisibility, I'm wondering, am I getting it, right? And I'm wondering whether my subconscious and my around my neuroses, my excitement, whatever is triggering my neurons is somehow it's accessible to me. So I think all the stakeholders really have different levels of accessibility that happens within themselves. You might call it invisibility. And I think it's really an interesting question as to the duality of the recipient and the participant, and being the participant and the recipient, but not the creator. And yet we are the creator in terms of our own experience of what you created. And I don't know that what is effective for me will ever be effective for anyone else.
I mean, I think that the question of multiple stakeholders is key there. And it's okay if things are meaningful to different people in different ways. And that's something that Art alluded to, and I think it's something that's really to be expected. You know, the people who are going to use the station in the shopping mall in Karachi are not the same people who care about how many people visited it at the State Department, right? But they all have a stake in how it comes out.
Yeah, and sorry, am I interrupting? No. When I started making work like this, I met this incredible artist from Barcelona, José María Martín, and he had just finished a project in Mexico City where there's like an underpass and there are these kids that shine shoes, and he had managed to make a building for them to actually, like almost like a community center just for them. There was incredible architecture that actually was a site where the government created social services for them. And I was like, how did you do this? And he said, oh, I just made sure the architects thought they were making architecture. The government thought they were making a social center. The museum thought they were funding an art work by me. And the kids thought they were getting exactly what they wanted. And it's this idea of like making like a diamond out of it, where each facet is what each stakeholder wants.
Hi, my name is Todd, and here what you're talking about, I'd like to ask you, in what ways can you be explicit, like usually what Todd and Art are saying about what is the depth of engagement in your project with the community? Like, specify.
I guess I use the term sweat equity, which is to say showing up, expanding beyond whatever your comfort level is, which initially, of course, is going to be working with local organizations within the community, like, you know, you're going to partner with schools and other institutions and organizations. That's important. For me, the depth of engagement means actually being out there on the street and kind of drawing people into the project in a long-term way. But that varies according to the project. Right? So I'm specifically talking about like the engagement in the neighborhood class point.
For me, you know, I mean, I also want to be really clear that, you know, this is a collective-based project. I mean, the association that is a legal structure under Brazilian law that allows it to happen, that allows it to attract funding locally so that it may happen, is a membership-based body. And of course, that was an idea that came from, you know, experience creating legal structures to run projects. But, you know, it's, you know, I mean, I could say it from a few different angles. Like, for example, during the material phase of the project, I will be there. Over the last 10 years, I've spent, you know, cumulatively a year or so, you know, been there for 6 months at a time, been there for a week at a time, you know, so a lot of trips. But again, it wouldn't, I know, again, like internal litmus tests and projects, if it hadn't already achieved a more populous instigation team than myself, then I wouldn't believe in it as much. And I think that, you know, there's the legal structure that allows it, but then there's also the members that have joined it and are kind of tussling with what membership will mean as it grows to own, you know, sort of a capital project, a restaurant. And also I wanted to just briefly speak to what you said about just the different notions of effectiveness. One thing that I've done, and it's just a slight twist, flip of the hand or twist of the hand, if you will, but it's important, is that once I realized there would be a project and that it would be about 3 years of material project, art project framing, and that the goal would be that the restaurant would outlive the art project, and that by dating the art project expiring it, you would be able to tell if it lived past it. It could have been a 3-year project, but I really intentionally made it a 5-year project to include the 2 first years that would be somewhat invisible. That would be bureaucracy. That would be, even me doing an immersion Portuguese school, which is built into the project. And I do try to externalize that. Right now, I have a blog on Residency Unlimited's website. Of course, it gets neglected whenever I get busy with other things, but it's really important. I want to explain how this very murky, it's hard. I mean, U.S. bureaucracy is hard to understand. So for sure, Brazilian bureaucracy is hard to understand. And I want to explain it. I want to talk about, once an assumption is wrong and I hit a wall and I have to create a workaround. And one of the things I was going to read, I think I can memorize it, but it's a definition for this Portuguese word, and I think it might be a Brazilian Portuguese, but I'm not sure the etymology, but it's gambiarra, and Dylan and I have talked a little bit about it, but it's this word in Brazilian culture for the workaround. And the workaround is, or how you get past a problem, is a really sort of coveted notion in Brazilian culture. And so I love that it exists as a framework, and I've even had people refer to how we're meandering or zigzagging through the project as a sort of gambiarra infused approach, and so it's just kind of a word I'd like to throw onto the stage.
We have time for one more.
Can you suggest skills for visual artists who are early in their needs for social practice? What kind of skills they would need to develop?
I have, but I don't want to talk too much. I would just, it's not such a skill, but it's like, I've gotten to do this by default over the years, working as an arts administrator as well. But I think that, there's this notion in the art world and in art schools of the portfolio review, and I think as we gain a broader understanding of socially engaged art or social practice, that there is a variation on the portfolio review it's really interesting to think about. And I've seen it, and I'll go into this pocket just a little bit. I'm a filmmaker as well. I've trained as a filmmaker and have dabbled in film and film festival management. And when I first saw this project, The Good Pitch, which is something that was created by the Channel 4 Film Fund and Sundance, etc., but it's a very performative space around that social issue documentaries are selected to, and it's live brainstorming. And I thought to myself, this is kind of a social practice portfolio review specific to film, but I thought, wow, there's potential to spread that out. And what I mean by that is you have to be talking to people in movements, you have to be talking to people in NGOs, you have to be talking to people with issue specialty depth on the thing that you're approaching. And that would create almost a new portfolio review process, I think.
I also think that artists, one of the first things artists are trained to do is to look, right? To see, that's what drawing is about. And I think that you can't go into the world as you wish it were. You have to really look at it and go into the world as it is. That doesn't mean you have to accept it, but you also, it's like a weird balance. It's like, this is the way things are, and I will operate there. Not as you wish it were, but as it is. Doesn't mean conformity, but it doesn't help anyone to go with a utopian vision and then clash with reality and be like, blah, because when you have to deal with bureaucracy, with the law, with people who are too busy to be engaged, you just have to deal with reality as it is. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, and also I think an awareness that any community you're entering already has the skill set that they need, right? They have the creativity. It's not like we're going in and donating our higher order skills. So I think the most interesting skill is maybe an unlearning process, come up in like traditional art education, to understand that fact, right? That difficult to understand fact that communities that might be underserved in terms of material resources still have the creativity and everything they need. And then figuring out what your role can be as a facilitator.
That's a great place to end it. Thank you very much.